Okay guys, so the title of these notes should be Unit 3, Photosynthesis, just like it says on the top of your notes in your outline book. And then all we're doing is we're pulling out the main things. So the first bold word you see there is autotroph. So you should have autotroph written down on the left-hand side. And we see that auto means self, troph means feeding. So you can go ahead and write that there too. And then the main thing here is just that these are organisms that make their food. And I want you guys to try to put these notes in your own words. Try not to write down exactly how it is already written, just because you're supposed to be simplifying it. And so we know that an example of an autotroph, an example of something that makes their own food, would be a plant. The next bold word we see is heterotroph. And we see that hetero means other. And we already know that troph means feeding. So these are organisms that eat other things. And so an example of a heterotroph would be us. Okay. So moving on down, we have chlorophyll. And you don't have to leave these biggest spaces. Really, I would try not to skip lines, just because you don't want to end up with 12 pages of Cornell notes. That's going to be a pain in the butt. And we see that phyll means pigment. Chloro means green. Okay. And so here we need to pull out the things that are important. And so our notes are talking about photosynthesis, so hopefully that light-absorbing pigment is something that really stands out to you. So chlorophyll is what lets plants absorb light. It says that your chlorophyll is the middle ground layer. It's found mainly in the mesophyll layer of ground tissue on plant leaves, and we see that meso also means middle. So we could say middle layer of plant ground tissue. Which for me, I don't know what ground tissue means. So I'm going to put off to the side here a little question. What is ground tissue? So I know that I need to come back later on and try to find that answer on my own. And if I really can't find it on my own, then I need to ask Ms. Davis when we get to class. Okay, so I think those are our main points in the chlorophyll. So let's move right on down to Roman numeral 4, where we see chloroplast. And we know that chloro means green already, but plast we see means container. Chloroplast. And so what I see here is it's telling me about the structure, which is that it has these things called thylakoids. Which is a green disc that have chlorophyll in them. Let's see. We see that grana is another bold word, and all that grana are a stack of thylakoids. And again, please don't write down every single word that I write down. Make sure that the only things you're writing down are the things that are important. No, sir, you need to go to your third period class.
Did you tell my feeling?
You need to go to your third period class.
Alright.
Your stroma are the watery space around the thylakoids. And so, to me, based on what this section says, you see up at the top it says these are organelles like the ones in eukaryotes. You see that we have this structure in the middle, and then we have a watery space. I know we've talked about chloroplasts before, so now would be a really smart time to go back and look through your notes and see what we were saying about these chloroplasts. But to me, this sounds a lot like a cell, right? So your cell has organelles, which is kind of like the thylakoid, is kind of like organelles inside of the chloroplast. And it's got a watery space that we call a cytoplasm. So I would make a little note here that this is kind of like cytoplasm. Right? So hopefully by now you've found the picture of where we drew chloroplasts before. If not, then make sure that it ends up in your notes now. But we know that it's going to be green. We know that it's kind of a circular shape. Right? And it says that we've got these things called thylakoids, and they're in stacks that we call grana. And then we've got this watery substance in the middle there that's called our stroma. So let's make sure that we go ahead and label that, because this picture is great and all, but it doesn't do us any good if we don't know what's what. So each individual one of these is a thylakoid. This big stack is a grana, and then this watery stuff in the middle is our stroma. Right? So now we know what it looks like, but what does it do? So let's look through. Things that should stand out to you right off the bat are those things in bold, right? So we see ATP and NADPH. We talked about ATP in the last unit, so you should already kind of have an idea of what that is. But your chloroplasts are going to make ATP and NADPH, which is just another way of saying energy. Remember that capital E in your notes means energy. So it also tells us that the light reaction happens in the thylakoid. Whereas the light independent reaction, which is also called the dark or the Calvin cycle, is going to happen in the stroma. And those are the big things that I pull from there. I see it holds water needed for photosynthesis. That might be an important thing to write down, but I don't feel like writing it down, so I'm not going to. If you want to put it in your notes, then you do that. These are your notes, so you need to write down whatever is important to you. Another question you might have is, what's the difference between this light and dark reaction, and what do they do? What's the product?
Hey, Ms. Davis.
You need to go to your class. So the next big Roman numeral we see is number 5. It says our photosynthesis chemical reaction. And so it says right off the bat what's going on here. We're taking sunlight and we're turning it into energy. And then after we turn that energy, we turn it into power. And then we turn it into sugar. And so that power there is just to make the sugar, right? So it's not actually like a big change there. Then the next thing that I see is our chemical equation. So chemical equation for photosynthesis is 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6 O2 and heat. But the big thing is this has to happen in the presence of sunlight, right? So let's look at that equation, because you guys are going to see that equation a lot. This 6 CO2, you remember I told you that plants and humans work together really well. And it's not just humans, it's plants and everything work really well. CO2 is what we breathe out. It's what the dog breathes out, it's what your cat breathes out, it's what anything that's alive, or well, any animal is going to breathe out CO2. And then you see over here that your plants make oxygen, which we know, right? Oxygen comes from trees. So they take what we breathe out, and we take what they kind of breathe out. They also need water, and they need sunlight, which we already know, right? Plants can't grow without sunlight and water. And what that makes, though, is it's going to make a sugar. That's what C6H12O6 is, the chemical formula for sugar. And it's going to make oxygen, it's going to make heat. So go ahead and get yourself familiar with that equation. I promise you're going to see it a whole lot. And then we have the H2O splits, not the CO2.
Hey, he's in your class.
I don't have a class right now. He might be in the library. That's where they have the online class, but I do not have a class right now.
She's going through it now. Mr. Pritchard has her switching the schedules up. He's been moved to my 6th period, and they're creating you a class for this period. He's the only one that's been added to the class right now because she's still trying to change the students over.
Well, I don't have anything for him to do, so he can just sit in the library for right now.
Okay.
Your CO2 is going to split, or excuse me, your H2O is going to split, not your CO2. Your sugar is stored for cell respiration. And so all I'm doing is going down right now through the notes and writing down the big things that stand out. So the next big thing I see is that you have two processes involved in the conversion of sunlight energy into sugar. Your light reaction is going to change sunlight into ATP and NADPH. Whereas your dark reaction, or your Calvin cycle, and so you don't need to write that out every single time. Just make sure that you're familiar that those three things are all the same thing. Calvin cycle, dark reaction, light independent reaction, they're all the same thing. But it's going to take that ATP and NADPH plus some CO2, and out is going to come a sugar, right? And so that actually, if we come back up here, answers my question that I had earlier about what it does, what it's going to make, all that fun stuff. Now, we can either take it a step further, which I would encourage you to do because this is an advanced class, and we can loop this sugar around, and we know that that's going to go into cell respiration. So now we've started a cycle, right? So we see that light reaction is going to come first. It's going to take in your sunlight and make ATP or NADPH. That NADPH and ATP are going to combine with CO2 during the Calvin cycle, or your dark or light independent cycle, to make sugar, which is then going to be stored for cell respiration to be used later on. And so this is what I want you doing with your notes. I like to draw pictures. I think it keeps me focused a little bit better, but you do not need to. I would definitely go back through, though, and highlight this. Make sure that you have the important parts starred. Make sure you understand what the take-home part of this is, right? Because by now we should kind of have an idea of what kind of questions are going to pop up on our test or on our data set or whatever. So make sure that you're taking notes that you can follow and you can understand. If you don't understand it, you need to make a note that you don't understand it. Don't just write something down if you don't know what it means. Now, in this bottom section, I want 3 main points to take home from these notes. And it should really kind of cover everything. I should be able to look at this section and tell what all is on this front page. Now, keep in mind, you're not done with these notes. You need to finish it. We stopped at about E, so you still need to do F and G, as well as Roman numeral 6 and the back half there. So you're going to carry on in the back, but down here, I just want this half of the page summarized. Okay, so 3 big things we can take from this. Let's start at the top. We're talking about photosynthesis, so we know our focus is going to be on plants. So we can say that plants are autotrophs that make food through photosynthesis. Right? And I wouldn't even bother saying anything about heterotrophs here because, I mean, are we talking about heterotrophs here? No. We're talking about photosynthesis. We're talking about things that make their own food. So, plants are autotrophs that make food through photosynthesis. Then we can say that chloroplasts are structures that contain chlorophyll, which is responsible for absorbing sunlight. Absorbing sunlight. Okay, so far we've covered what autotrophs are and how they relate to photosynthesis, what chlorophyll is, and what chloroplasts are. So now we need to summarize this last section. So our third bullet could be that chloroplasts use photosynthesis to turn sunlight into ATP and NADPH through the light reaction, then sugar in our Calvin cycle, dark reaction, however you want to say it. I'm going to say Calvin cycle, which is stored for cell respiration. Okay? And so what you end up with is this page full of notes where if I am studying for right before the test, I can read this section down here. And let's say, oh yeah, I totally get that, autotrophs, that's really simple. But chloroplasts, what are these chloroplasts? I can zoom in and read this section and refresh myself on what chloroplasts are. So you want to make sure that your notes are simplifying everything, but they need to include everything, especially those bold words. But don't just sit down and write down the bold words, because that's not going to help you any if all you're doing is writing them down or just writing down that and their definition. You need to make sure you understand what they mean. So to recap, make sure that we have our completed Cornell notes on 3.1 photosynthesis. So I've done half of it for you. You need to do the other half. You also need to transfer all of your notes from your composition notebook into your outline book. So Unit 1 and Unit 2 should be completely annotated. There should be notes all over them. And then the last thing is I want you to just read through Unit 3. You don't need to understand everything. You don't need to take Cornell notes on everything yet, but you need to have at least read through it. All right, so have a good break, and I will see you guys on Monday.